Please be seated. Oh, holy and amazing God, again we thank you for this chance to gather together for worship. May your Spirit move among us and fill us with power, but more importantly, fill us with love for one another and for you. Oh Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our collective hearts be pleasing in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So we're in the middle of a three-part series on We Are Family, and no, I didn't cue up the Sister Sledge song this week, but probably running through some of your minds like it is mine. But last week we talked about the church's family, how we're there to support one another and encourage one another and pray for one another, and how important that is, that we be united in the thing that makes us the same, our faith in Jesus Christ. This week we'll look at the family as a church, or as church. Next week we'll look at family ties. So the family is church. Now, many of us are old enough to remember Art Linkletter. He had a segment in his shows called Kids Say the Darndest Things. I like the story of a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old who presented their mom with a house plant that they'd used their own money to buy for her, and she was just thrilled, that her young children saved their own money and bought her the plant. The older of them said with a sad face, "There was a beautiful bouquet in the flower shop, but it was too expensive. We couldn't afford it. But it had this pretty red ribbon on it that said, 'Rest in peace.'" And we know you always want more rest, so we thought that was appropriate, but we just couldn't get it for you. Families, we argue. we don't always get along, but families are filled with stories and memories. Some are humorous, and we can laugh. Some are sad and tear at our hearts. But always it's family. We need to remember that. Hopefully, some of our stories are about the faith that we share. In the big game of life, what really matters? I find myself asking that question more and more these days. The blessing of surviving to a ripe old age is that it causes us to reflect more, to pull up the floorboards of our soul and examine the priorities in life. What's really important? What matters not today, but what will matter for eternity? What will make a difference? I used to worry about losing golf balls. Although they're expensive, it's who cares anymore, Somebody gets paid to make them every day, right? Lost people, however, now that's something important. Church conferences and church meetings, I'm not so thrilled with them anymore either. Maybe I never was, but churches filled with people, churches reaching out to people, making a difference in their community, that's important. That's part of our legacy. Family status is not going to matter when Jesus looks at us. However, I think our family faith will make a big difference in how he looks at us. Today I want to talk pragmatically about the faith of our families. On what do you and your family set your hearts and shape your life? What's really important? What's the overarching, integrating, grounding faith that gives life unity and meaning? And how can you communicate that faith to your children and grandchildren or others? In many ways, what happens in our family house is more important than what happens in the White House. It has more of an impact, more of a difference. So what's the faith factor in your family? Paul wrote to his young friend Timothy, and he begins by noting the sincere, genuine, unwaxed faith which first lived in his grandmother Lois and then in his mother Eunice, and now has become the guiding light of Timothy's life as well. Timothy was raised by a single mother and an influential grandmother. His father was an unbeliever, had either divorced the family or died. And back in a day when it was almost impossible for a single mother to make it, Eunice, with the help of Lois and by faith in God, pulled it off. Now, there's a sports culture thing that says, be like Mike. That's Michael Jordan for you who don't follow sports. But I think in the church, rather than be like Mike, we need to say, be like Lois and Eunice. James Dobson tells of his great-grandfather, George McCluskey, who spent an hour from 11 a.m. to noon every day praying for his family, praying intercessory prayers for not only his family, not only his children, but for the generations to come that weren't born yet. And Dobson describes the fascinating way that God answered that prayer in the lives of the children and grandchildren of McCluskey. Dobson wrote, "There have been times as I have sat on the platform of a large church waiting to speak that I have felt the presence of that old man. It staggers the mind to realize that the prayer of this one man, spoken more than 50 years ago, can reach across 4 generations of time and influence developments in my life today." What's the faith factor in your family? Who prayed for you? And who are you praying for? On a scale of 1 to 10, how important is faith development in your family life today? What's the faith factor of your family? Does it hold its own with soccer or baseball or whatever, success in the business world? See, faith is a lifelong development process. We're justified and accepted by Christ the moment we say yes to Him. But we should spend the rest of our life growing closer to Him and more like Him. It's what we call sanctification. And that faith comes partially by experience. But I think, it's felt before it's formulated. Joseph and Mary took the baby Jesus to the temple to be dedicated when he was 8 days old. And I wonder, when we baptize a baby, they don't realize what's going on. But, we baptize them and call the church to pray for him and be there for him. But, maybe Jesus had a better idea of what was going on. Maybe even at 8 days old, he knew. But faith, we used to say in an after-school program, is more caught than taught. Yeah? We catch it more than we learn it. When a mother nurses an infant, she's communicating God's care. When a father bandages a cut, he's extending God's healing. And when families play together, they experience God's joy, laughter and joy. And when families forgive, they practice grace, God's grace. Families learn there are sacred communities when they begin to name and claim the many forms of God's grace that's in their daily life, their everyday routine life. And faith deepens by belonging. Can you say, now I belong to Jesus, and Jesus belongs to me? Not just for however many years and days we get in this world, but for eternity. That kind of thought should make a difference to us no matter how old we are. We need to belong. We have that ingrained in us. Dick Murray tells in one of his books about Mrs. Pickford. She was one of his elementary school teachers. He says, "I don't remember what she taught us, but I remember Mrs. Pickford very well. She was gracious, understanding, and warm. She made us feel valuable and able and safe. The only problem was she was naive. She kept saying she was sure I wouldn't do anything wrong, when I knew that I was planning things all along. The strange thing is I often proved her right because I didn't want to let her down. When I started to do wrong, I would remember Mrs. Pickford. And when I read Dick's story, I thought about my own family. I thought about how, I wasn't always a good kid, try as I might. But sometimes maybe I stayed out of harm's way or out of trouble because I didn't want to disappoint my family. I didn't want to let them down. And maybe respect for my family, I've got to mix in with a little bit of fear of getting the belt or something, but caused me to stop sometimes and not do what I know is wrong. Our faith deepens when we know we belong to that family, biologically and spiritually. When that connection is strong, our faith grows. It also grows by questioning. You know, there are some that say, well, you can't question, that's wrong. You know, no, I disagree. Reader's Digest ran a list of proverbial why is it a few years ago. It said, why is it that some people have a great frame of mind, but no picture? Why is it that you pay for a shortcut in the long run? Why is it that a chip on your shoulder is a pretty heavy load? Why is it that jumping to conclusions is not half as good an exercise as digging for the facts? Why is it that the employee who butters up the boss is usually the one who doesn't cut the mustard? The reality is that faith has its questions too. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why does evil seem to prosper? Where is God when I'm hurting? If life is a bowl of cherries, why am I always with the pits? Why is this happening to me? We will all ask those questions, and we need to sometimes. And we don't always get an answer to those questions, like why do bad things happen to good people? There's no answer to that. But when we wrestle with the question, when we live into the questions, we'll find that peace that Jesus promises that passes our human understanding, even when there's not an answer. You can discover a peace that passes all understanding in the midst of the question. Jesus said, ask and you will receive. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened. Asking, seeking, knocking are just as much a part of our faith as is receiving, finding, and opening. And our faith endures through maturity. Growing in faith, what Methodists call sanctification, is a lifelong process, as I said. Ephesians 4:13 from the Message says, God wants us to grow up, to know the whole truth and tell it in love, to be like Christ in everything, at least the best we can be. Michael Tate of DC Talk says, my dad taught me two very important things: love people, all kinds of people, and live for God. Don't get caught up in the things of this world. And that's where our Christian maturity lies, when we can love people and live life for God. Paul wrote, be in the world, but not of the world. Don't let the world rule you. Love people, live for God. So again, what's the faith factor in your family? Where does it measure on the scale of importance? And what can we do to fan those flames of faith? Paul says to Timothy, for this reason I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God which is in you. The images of a campfire that has gone out, is still smoldering during the night, and you have to dig down through the ashes to find a live coal. And how do you get that coal to come back to flame? You got to fan it. You got to give it some air. Bring it forth. As we sing and pass it on, it only takes a spark to get a fire going. And soon all those around can warm up in its glowing. So how do we fan those flames of faith that will spread and warm up those around us? How do we fan it in our own lives and the lives of those we love? First of all, most importantly, maybe we need to live the faith. Walk the talk, as we might say. I once saw a plaque on a wall that read, I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. I had a friend who's since passed at the Roscoe Church used to say, your actions speak so loud I can't hear your words. Maybe that's what we need. The plaque also said, I'd rather one should walk with me than merely show the way. The eye is a better pupil, more willing than the ear. Fine counsel is confusing, but example is always clear. And the best of all, the preachers are the ones who live their creeds. And that's not just true of preachers, that's true of all of us. When we live the faith. For to see good put into action is what everybody needs. I knew someone years ago that closed letters, emails, even conversations. His catchphrase was, love is a verb. It's not just a feeling or an emotion. It's a verb and it needs to be put into action. One pastor commented that when their oldest son was going through those adolescent struggles, as teenagers do, struggling with the faith, he said to his dad, "Well, those people at church think you're pretty great, but they don't have to live with you. I do." I'm sure that's true of many families. Brennan Manning, author of The Ragamuffin Gospel, wrote, "The greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips and walk out the door and deny him with their lifestyle. That is what an unbelieving world finds unbelievable." We've got to live our faith, not just talk about it. We can infer that this applies even more in our families. I mean, somebody might see us on the street or at Kroger's and, see us doing good or living that lifestyle, but our families see us a whole lot more often, right? So we have much more chances to be that example, to lead by example. Does your family see you living the lifestyle that Jesus teaches, or do they get the message, do as I say, not as I do? My father drilled that into me, but maybe some of you heard that too. But Christians lead by example, by living their faith. And then we can tell the story. The stories of our faith need to be embedded in our hearts and often on our lips. Children love a good story. That's why, we read to them before bedtime. And as we sing, the stories of faith are pleasant to repeat. It seems each time more wonderful, wonderfully sweet. A young boy came home from Sunday school and was all excited to tell his parents about Adam and Eve. And his mom said, "What does that story tell you?" And he said, "Well, it tells us that Adam and Eve made some bad choices." That the child got it. He got the message. And we can identify with the stories in the Bible. Who doesn't think sometimes that they're a prodigal, right? Wandered away and always welcomed home? Or sometimes we're more the older brother who's just a little self-righteous and harder to love. But we find ourselves in these faith stories. The problem of our day is that the only people telling the stories are on television, YouTube, or maybe TikTok. Most of them are trying to sell you something. They're not really promoting the faith. And we need to recover the art of telling the stories of the faith so that we can fan into flame the fires. Don't let that fire go out. Instill it in yourself and pass it on. Be like Lois and Eunice in Timothy's life. Share the stories of your faith with your children or your grandchildren. If you don't have any of those, share it with your neighbor, your friends, people you meet on the street. Your family is more than the biology, as we talked about last week. Share the faith. Always be ready to share how God has made a difference in your life. In communication classes, they teach the art of the elevator speech, or an elevator pitch. It's a concise summary designed to quickly convey who you are, what you do, or the value you can bring, or the value your product can bring. And the term comes from the idea that you should be able to deliver this speech during a short elevator ride. So it's got to be clear, it's got to be concise, it's got to be engaging. And I encourage you to have an elevator speech ready. Not trying to promote yourself or sell a product, but simply to spread the good news of what Jesus has done in your life, how your faith has made a difference and maybe brought you joy and peace and hope. And we need to pray more. We can be still and know that God is God. Pastor Howard Olds wrote a few years ago, I was speaking down at Mount Eagle Assembly for a spiritual emphasis week, and I noticed on the brochure that quiet time was held on the campus every afternoon from 1 to 2:30. And in the morning, there's kids everywhere, toddlers and teenagers, and they're riding bikes, and they're swimming, and they're playing, and they're having fun. And I said to someone, this quiet time thing doesn't really work, does it? Much to my surprise, the whole campus got quiet at 1 p.m. And I said to some parents, how do you pull that off? And they said, that's just what we do here. Everybody knows it's quiet time. Be still and know that I am God. Are there places and times where you can take a step back and even as a family get quiet and maybe pray? Richard Foster says, I like to lay my hands on my children lightly as they're asleep and imagine the light of Christ healing whatever trauma they might have had that day and then filling them with peace and hope for the next day. We can teach breath prayers. You might not know what those are. They're short, concise prayers that you can repeat with each breath as you need them. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Breathe in, breathe out. You are my refuge and my strength. Peace, be still. Calm my heart. Lord, help me make it through this day or this night. Short, easy to remember prayers to have when you need them. You know, the family that prays together stays together. Sounds trite, but I think it's true. And I don't have to tell you that families around us are falling apart. Borne out by some statistics, they're outdated. I don't know when I found this list. They're from the 90s, I think. But I'll bet they're even worse today. It said there's been a 200% growth in single-parent households since 1970, from 4 million to 8 million. The number of married moms leaving home for work each morning rose 65%. Married couples with children now make up only 26% of U.S. households, down from 40%. 36% of children said their chores include making their own meals. 13% said the same thing 13 years earlier. An estimated 70% of juvenile offenders come from single-parent families. The average child has watched 8,000 televised murders and 100,000 acts of violence before they finish elementary school. And with video games, it's probably even more than that. 1 in 6 youths between the ages of 10 and 17 has seen or known someone who'd been shot. Estimated number of child abuse victims increased 40%. And children under 18 are 240% more likely to be killed by guns than they were in 1986. Now, I got to backtrack and say those numbers paint a bleak picture of single-parent families, and that's not fair. It doesn't matter how many parents or how many children. What's important is that faith, that we share that faith, that we love them, and that we love God. And that we teach them about God and let them catch God through our lives. A study completed at the University of Rhode Island described the American home as the most dangerous place outside of riots and war. Imagine that. But alongside those facts that are pretty depressing, put this. Newsweek magazine discovered that a surprisingly large percent of Americans believe deeply in the efficacy of prayer. According to a Gallup poll they commissioned, 78% of Americans said they prayed once a week, and 57% prayed at least once a day. Now, there's probably some in there that say, well, that's what you want to hear, so I'm going to say it, but still, the number seems pretty high. But maybe that 78% that pray once a week are in church when they say the Lord's Prayer, right, in a minute. And I'm sorry. That's not enough. You need more than that. But when I think about the problems we have in the home and the prayer that's going on, evidently, I'm convinced that not enough of that prayer is happening in the home. Maybe it's happening in church or somewhere, but we need more of it in the home. We need to use the power of prayer to bring our families together, to put them together, but more importantly, to keep them together. Some may be in a marriage that they think is hopeless, that nothing or nobody can help. You may think you have children who are so far gone that nothing or nobody can bring them back. But there are two things that your child or your spouse or your friend cannot fight. They can't fight your prayer, and they can't fight your love. Sidlow Baxter once said, "Men may spurn our appeals, reject our message, oppose our arguments, despise our persons, but they're helpless against our prayers. Nothing they can do about those." So pray for your family, your extended family. And finally, we need to serve our neighbors. And the children need to see that as an example. Because families are not an end in themselves. We're just one piece of the fabric of society. One of the things we can do is help a child cultivate a vision for the world. That's why things like mission trips are so important in the formation of young people. Help them to lift their eyes to see the rest of the world around them. We can encourage the values of faith over the values that the culture would tell us. We can encourage being as opposed to doing, sharing as opposed to possessing, mercy rather than revenge, and equality rather than control. We can teach people that. We can teach people how to be generous. There was a child named William. He placed $1 in the offering plate and he attached a note to it. It said, "Dear God, I love you much. When I get to heaven, I want to love you even more. I want to give you something today and bow down to you forever." Signed, William. Now, William was probably no more than 6 or 7 years old. And with that sense of generosity at that young of an age, imagine what he might accomplish later in life. What help he might be for a world when as a young child he's learned to be so generous and to share in the needs of humanity. One pastor told me, "I used to take my son with me to visit the nursing home. And it got to the point they didn't care if I came, but they wanted my child to come. They wanted to see the smile of a child, delight in their presence." You know, you don't have to wait for the church to get together a trip or to do something. You know, do something yourself. Do it with your family. Stop and visit someone you haven't seen in church for a while. Stop and visit a shut-in. Stop at Eastern Star and just talk to people. You know, it's easy to say, "Well, I don't know what to say." Well, you don't have to say anything. The best gift we can give is our time. Spend some time with somebody that's lonely. Fan those flames of fire of faith, because that's what matters in the light of eternity. That's what Jesus will judge you by. You know, did we feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the sick and imprisoned? When it comes to your family, are you investing in the things that really matter? Paul says to his young friend Timothy, "God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but a spirit of power, of love, and of self-discipline." Keep the faith burning, fan the flames. It could make an eternal difference. Conclude with this. Sloan Wilson, the author of The Man in a Gray Flannel Suit, wrote about teaching a child to ride a bicycle. He said a certain amount of guidance and direction is required if you're going to teach your child to ride a bicycle. But at some indefinable point, the hovering father has to let go, or the child will never learn to ride the bicycle. The whole purpose of the process will be frustrated and will be futile. You know, sometimes letting go is painful, but letting go is an important part of loving. We need to prepare our families to live that love of faith, even when we're not around watching them. That it would be so deeply instilled that they would know no other way than to follow Jesus. May it be true for all of us and all those we care about.